The peace plan has reached a dead end. Russia has publicly rejected the US peace initiative.
There can be no talk of any concessions or surrendering our positions, including in the context of the special military operation.
First peace, then security guarantees. The US is changing the agreements.
I think if Ukraine makes a deal, it will be good.
Moldova has humiliated Russia.
Scandal in Moldova. The Russian ambassador was summoned to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and right at the entrance, they pointed out the very drone that had crashed into a residential building.
Russia is losing its sovereignty. Putin is bending to China.
The head of Rosneft assured that Russia is ready to supply China with energy as long as it pursues its own strategic goals, in effect to become a resource appendage of Beijing.
Witkov is facing the threat of dismissal. Russia is covering for the Kremlin's agent.
Of course, there will be many people who won't shy away from anything to disrupt this process.
Lukashenko can't sit still. He tries to cozy up to the US but doesn't forget about Putin either.
In Bishkek, the president of Belarus stated that he is ready to once again host negotiations on Ukraine.
They fight for nothing but a thank you. SVO participants are losing their payments. And this is just the beginning.
I'll be honest, stopping payments to combatants in Yakutia, Khakassia, and Zabaikalsky Krai is a difficult decision, but the right one.
So, November 27th, friends, despite Thanksgiving Day in the United States of America, the war is not over, even though Donald Trump pointed to this deadline just last week. But aside from Ukraine, it seems that there is real gunfire happening within the United States itself. Here, Marco Rubio is informing European allies that the US wants to conclude a peace agreement between the US and Ukraine without any security guarantees for Ukraine. And in general, the states are intimidating Europe, saying that if they don't support Trump's initiative, the war will soon start on their own territory. Let's now watch a short, informative segment about all this madness. Afterwards, I'll be waiting for you in the studio to discuss the details. Let's go.
Donald Trump's special envoy Witkov is an extremely pro-Russian diplomat. There have long been rumors that Steve likes Moscow, where he happily eats chebureki for breakfast. But now, Bloomberg has published a transcript of a conversation between Witkov and Putin's advisor, Ushakov, which took place on October 14th. The American directly suggested to the Russian side that they get ahead of Ukraine and talk to Trump before his meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. Donald's friend gave the Russians tips on what words to use to win over the American president.
Witkov is completely playing on Russia's side, offering strategies and his services, adapting himself to Russia as much as possible. And around Trump, he builds very bizarre, phantom-like semantic castles against Ukraine. Now, this has become known.
This leak is one of the biggest scandals in Donald's circle during his second coming to the Oval Office. Political experts are surprised at how the Russians are manipulating the Americans.
In the phone conversation, it is Ushakov who comes across as the professional, easily telling Witkov that Russia, in order to please Trump and recognize his peacemaking efforts, even refused to hold the Russia-Arab summit. But that's a deception, because it was actually the leaders of the Arab countries who refused to go to Moscow, since they started to focus primarily on Trump and only then on Putin. Ushakov calmly presents this defeat of Russian diplomacy to the inexperienced Witkov as a goodwill gesture from the Kremlin. And there are many such episodes in these conversations.
A sensational leak should have led to personnel changes in Trump's inner circle, but the American president surprised journalists with his apparent indifference. All methods are fair game, Trump assured, as long as it serves his interests.
This is a standard thing, you see. He needs to sell this to Ukraine. He needs to sell Ukraine to Russia. That's exactly what he's doing, the one who makes deals. Against the backdrop
of the scandal, Trump sent Witkov to Moscow for negotiations and his new representative Driscoll back to re-establish contact with the Ukrainian side. According to Donald, there is now no deadline for signing a framework agreement with Zelensky, but analysts claim that the US continues to put pressure on Kyiv. The 47th President of America is not opposed to meeting with Zelensky, but only after he signs the required document. Meanwhile, the media reports that Ukrainian diplomats managed to fend off and reword at least 3 points from the document, written and translated by Dmitry Witkov. And during his first visit to the Ukrainian capital, Daniel Driscoll assured the Ukrainian military that they would undoubtedly suffer.
Defeat is the experience of not achieving victory or success in a particular situation, often resulting in feelings of disappointment or the need to reflect and learn from the outcome in order to improve and try again in the future. Because the goal of this plan is not to freeze the Russian-Ukrainian war, nor to stop the Russian-Ukrainian war. The goal of this plan, which was written by the Russians, is to buy time and to prevent Trump from imposing even more sanctions on the so-called Russian Federation right now.
In the White House, there are already concerns that the Kremlin might completely reject the updated peace plan. Now, it will be interesting to see how Stephen Witkov's trip to the White Stone will end. What will they treat him to, and what rewards will they present to their supporter from Trump's circle?
So Oleg Pasternak, a political technologist, is joining our broadcast. Hello, we're glad to see you.
Yes, indeed. Greetings.
Well, Oleg, let's discuss this. The 27th, could you please tell us, nothing is changing in terms of what Donald Trump promised or demanded regarding making a peace deal? It seems that nothing at all indicates this will happen anytime soon. Moreover, this Witkov gate, these recordings, it seems to me, have only drawn even more and more criticism around this plan, which everyone has already acknowledged was written by the Russians and is simply being supported by the states. How do you see the situation with this pressure to sign? As some kind of agreement as of now?
I see it as yet another attempt by the Americans to give a chance to a peaceful settlement in the form of an aggressive push, aiming to appease Russia and break through Ukraine's position. Skillfully and carefully changing, for example, the head of the main contact, the liaison, I'm talking about Daniel Driscoll, then by setting strict deadlines and later forgetting about them and removing them, then by creating a supposedly non-negotiable list of 28 points, which eventually turns into a trimmed, revised and corrected document, and then by publicly disregarding the position of the European Union, but fully understanding that. Without Europe, the reality of a peaceful settlement remains nothing more than an illusion, and also hoping that this will appease Putin, which leads to comments in the style of Rubio. And, in fact, there are already a number of personal comments and statements from President Vladimir Putin himself regarding any and all peace initiatives, which very clearly and unmistakably show that Putin is firmly set on pursuing further territorial adventurism and expansion. These remarks leave little doubt about his intentions. The biting off of Ukrainian territories, no matter what it costs him, and it costs him the lives of Russian soldiers, which is not a factor that would restrain him in the development of this scenario. So in essence, that's all we have. On the plus side, the Ukrainian delegation managed to fend off this diplomatic attack from the US. That must be acknowledged. It's quite difficult to understand because Dan Driscoll, according to some sources, will be in Kyiv again on Saturday. Will this be yet another attempt to demonstrate principle and toughness towards Ukraine? We'll see. But I think that all this shuttle diplomacy, all this fuss in the form of Witkov, Driscoll, Kellogg, who evidently is already losing his position, the visit of Zelensky to Trump, and the current impossibility of organizing it. Then it looks more like absolute Brownian motion, like an uncontrollable chaos, where tightly. In the White House, the interests of several influential groups are at play. Janes, whom in fact Driscoll represents, Witkov and Rubio in the Ukrainian government, who is currently under the influence of internal contradictions due to the ongoing corruption scandal, and who is obviously forced to show a certain degree of flexibility because they do not feel internal political stability. Furthermore, there is the factor of the inadequate aggressiveness coming from Russia and the actions of the war criminal Putin. Where, in this complex mix, in this so-called vinaigrette, do you want to see the outlines of peace? Well, perhaps in the form of those 28 points that no longer exist and those 19 points, let's call them the Geneva points, which Putin most likely will not accept. And if he does, only partially. The war is ongoing. I have said several times on air that right now we are in another military cycle of the war, which will obviously last until at least April. All other attempts by the Americans to somehow establish or fine-tune a peaceful dialogue look more like an endless game of tennis, where there is no scoreboard, where it's impossible to understand whose score it is, who it belongs to, and where the referee is, for the most part, playing on the side of one of the participants in this game. I mean, the United States, which is helping Russia, as evidenced by the publication in The Bomb. And all of this, of course, does not give us a solid foundation or ground for future stability.
Oleg, I also want to discuss what seems to be a domestic incident in the US, but I think it has relevance to global politics. Trump promised to tighten immigration restrictions after the shooting at National Guard members in Washington. Let me remind you, the person who did the shooting, so he's Afghan, 29 years old. Notably, he served in the Afghan army, which was actually created and formed by the United States when they had a presence in Kabul. And now he is not cooperating with law enforcement, but Trump said he would seriously address the whole issue of residency rights, not only for the Afghan diaspora in the United States, but also for other migrants. Tell me, don't you think that such incidents, and more importantly, Trump's reaction, are an attempt to somehow latch onto the domestic agenda to distract everyone from failures abroad? Or are these absolutely different things for Americans?
The topic of migration is very convenient for domestic political games, especially during election campaigns. By the end of 2025, Americans have gradually cooled toward Trump's anti-immigration rhetoric. To begin with, even if there are downturns in the American economy and the labor market, migrants are the backbone of employment in certain sectors of the economy, sectors where native-born Americans simply don't want to work, and this puts pressure on the market. But right now, this fits into Trump's political playbook. He will tighten immigration, and he has already, in essence, created significant obstacles for those who have received green cards through minor rules and instructions. There's an interesting incident. A relative turns out to be a relative of the new White House press secretary. She is also now subject to deportation because, in fact, she is a citizen of Belarus and Brazil, and obviously this is taking place on a mass scale, and the migration police is gradually turning into something very much like the National Guard, which also carries out certain important operations. In many states, the migration police is becoming a flashpoint, a trigger point, and in fact, this development led to the incident in Washington that you mentioned, the shooting and wounding of 2 National Guard officers. They will use this. It was only invented as a way to appoint officials, but now it is being used for broader purposes.
Let's talk more about our negotiations, because after all, this is a more important topic for Ukraine. Andriy Sybiha announced a meeting of negotiators from Ukraine, specifically the foreign ministers of Ukraine and the United States, in the near future. Please tell us, is there any prospect at all in these negotiations, or do we have a clear objective that everyone should understand, which is to make sure things don't get worse, to ensure that Trump simply has no grounds to refuse aid to Ukraine? In other words, not to make the situation worse than it is now? Or how do you see it?
Here, it's important to understand what currently forms the basis of American-Ukrainian relations. What is the position built on? Undoubtedly, my answer will not please many of our viewers. It is Trump's lack of principles. That is, under the Democrats, the idea was not to allow Ukraine to be defeated, but not to allow Ukraine to win. Under Trump, however, he is absolutely uninterested in how the Russian-Ukrainian war ultimately ends. What truly matters to him is to extract public relations benefits from the attempt to stop it, because ending the war aligns closely with US interests. It allows Americans to step back from European affairs and significantly shift their focus and attention toward China in the Far East. This is Trump's major overarching task. We've talked about it with you for a long time, and he continues to follow the course of needing to achieve this important goal and objective. So Ukraine is an obstacle for him, and that's why there's a lack of principles. He doesn't care what points 28, 19, or 50 will be. What matters to him is winning the Nobel Peace Prize. He cares about the reputation of being a peacemaker. He wants the crown that he will put on himself, like the ruler, the tamer of wars. How many wars is it now? 9? Perhaps even more if we count all the conflicts, both large and small, that have occurred over the years. These are just petty, fleeting, and ultimately inconsequential human passions, the kinds of emotions and desires that drive people to act in ways that are sometimes difficult to understand. These are defeated people, individuals who have lost in one way or another, who nevertheless hold high positions of authority and power. And they too, just like anyone else, are captive to these same passions and impulses. So there's really nothing particularly surprising or unexpected here, nothing that should shock us. When we describe Trump's values, we are talking about business values, values rooted in the world of commerce and negotiation, values of bargaining, values of exchange, values of having trump cards, as is commonly said in Trump's own vocabulary and language. That's why, for him, how the Ukrainian issue is ultimately resolved is, in principle, not important or decisive. This is the main problem, the central issue in our relations, where it was possible to build stable, predictable, reasonable, but also complicit relations under the Democrats, because the Americans, under democratic leadership, took an active part in helping Ukraine, providing Ukraine with military aid packages at critical moments, offering diplomatic support both in the Security Council and elsewhere, and making sure that Ukraine was not left alone in its time of need. On international platforms. But now that's no longer the case. Instead, we see the US initiating amendments to Security Council resolutions on Ukraine, so as not to call Russia an aggressor once again, and to remove from them the principles of territorial sovereignty and the integrity of our country. You understand, of course, that this is complete chaos in Ukrainian-American relations. Will we ever be able to reach a compromise? Probably, if we sign a security guarantees agreement, because after all, international law among Western countries is generally regarded as the most important value. If we bring our relations with the Americans onto a contractual basis, which in fact is demonstrated, for example, by the resource deal and the prospect of adopting and signing a security guarantees agreement, maybe this will lead to normalization, or more precisely, to some kind of strategic stability in our relationship. For now, that is definitely not the case. That's why the Minister of Foreign Affairs also understands just how damaged Ukrainian-American relations are right now, and how vulnerable they are to various informational and political attacks from the enemy of the Russian Federation.
Oleg, there's something else I'd like to ask you. To what extent, in your opinion, are the threats from the United States effective? There's a specific case concerning Europe. We're talking about the fact that the US Secretary of the Army, during his visit to Kyiv, when he was delivering Ukraine the so-called peace plan consisting of 28 points, told European diplomats about the missile threat from Russia, not only to Ukraine, but also to European countries. And the New York Times writes about this, and supposedly all of this is being done so that they will support Trump's so-called peace plan as quickly as possible. Tell me, please, do they fall for these fears, and do they understand that, yes, there is a threat, but nevertheless the terms are not acceptable? Or does the blackmail of European states actually work?
For some European countries, blackmail will indeed work on the least protected ones. That means Spain, Greece, and possibly some of the smaller European countries. Other countries have long since started very systematic work on rearming themselves and implementing plans to prepare their populations. For example, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, Poland, and to some extent the Baltic states, but their resources are still insufficient to withstand the prospect of facing a serious military machine like the Russian Federation. Part of Europe has woken up, becoming increasingly aware of the current situation, and is now living in a kind of pre-mobilization mode, carefully and deliberately preparing for a long and challenging journey towards significantly strengthening its own defense capabilities and military readiness. Unfortunately, some European countries, despite the growing evidence and warnings, continue to live in the fantasy that this is all just a game, refusing to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation and the potential consequences. Virtual geopolitical scenario games. But of course, the outlook of this whole situation is quite clear for Europeans, because the United States is obviously sending signals and making it clear that they will be winding down their military activity on the European continent. This is already evidenced by the reduction of American military personnel, for example, at certain military bases in Europe, and this will continue further. This is Trump's key goal, and in fact, this is what he promised to his voters.
Thank you very much. Ole Pasternak, political technologist, was on the air of Ukraine Today. All the best, Ole. Goodbye. All the
Best.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.